At the Plaza Hotel in New York City, under crystal chandeliers and in front of some of the most powerful people in America, a billionaire's wife poured red wine over a black CEO's head. Her name was Celeste Hawthorne. She didn't trip. She didn't lose her balance. She raised the glass, looked him straight in the eyes, and tilted it slowly. The wine ran down Malcolm Reed's face, darkening his collar, soaking into his tailored navy suit, dripping onto the white tablecloth of a VIP table where billion-dollar decisions were made in low voices. "You don't belong here," Celeste said, her voice sharp, controlled, unmistakably intentional. "People like you never do." The grand ballroom went silent. Forks stopped midair. Conversations died where they stood. 300 guests, generals, defense executives, venture capitalists, elected officials froze in their seats. Phones came out almost instinctively. Not everyone, but enough. This wasn't a drunken outburst at a bar. This wasn't a misunderstanding in a hallway. This was a high-profile charity gala invitation only, where reputations were currency and access was power. Malcolm Reed stood there, wine dripping from his chin, and didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He didn't wipe his face right away. Celeste Hawthorne set the empty glass on the table with a decisive clink, as if closing a case. "I'm tired of watching unqualified people borrow status," she continued. "Borrow seats. Borrow respect they didn't earn." A woman at the table whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else sucked in a breath. The musicians near the stage stopped playing. Malcolm finally reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. He wiped the wine from his cheek, slowly, deliberately, like a man with nothing to prove. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Very revealing." Celeste smiled. She believed she had just restored order. All evening, she had been watching him, this man who moved too comfortably through a room built on old money and old names. He hadn't networked like everyone else. He hadn't hovered. People came to him. Pentagon officials, tech founders, senior advisors. That bothered her. The American Futures Fund Gala wasn't just about charity. It was about proximity, about who sat where, about who was allowed to speak without being questioned. Celeste Hawthorne had spent her entire adult life enforcing those boundaries. Her family's company, Hawthorne Dynamics, had supplied defense systems to the U.S. government for generations. Her father-in-law liked to say their name was written into the architecture of American power. Her husband, Graham Hawthorne, now carried the title of CEO and the pressure that came with it. They needed tonight to go perfectly. The next morning, the Department of Defense was expected to finalize a short list for the Autonomous Systems Initiative, a program worth more than $1 billion. It was the kind of contract that didn't just save a company, it defined its future. Celeste believed rooms like this existed to protect families like hers. So when she saw Malcolm Reed sitting at a table with Brigadier General Claire Donovan laughing softly, listening more than speaking, she decided someone had made a mistake. Earlier, she had already corrected 2 servers, one for pouring champagne too slowly, one for touching the rim of a glass. She had smiled through both moments the way people do when they expect obedience. When she asked the event director, "You're verifying credentials at the VIP tables, right?" she wasn't asking. Now standing in front of Malcolm Reed, she felt certain she was right. "This table is reserved for actual partners," she said. Actual leaders. Malcolm looked at her calmly. My invitation says otherwise. Celeste laughed short and dismissive. I know everyone who matters here. Malcolm met her eyes. Then tonight might surprise you. That was when she lifted the glass. Security had taken 2 steps forward but stopped. No one wanted to touch this. Not yet. Not in a room full of cameras. Across the ballroom, Graham Hawthorne stood frozen, a cold weight settling in his chest. Celeste, he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of shock. What are you doing? She waved him off. Fixing a problem. Phones were recording openly now. Malcolm folded the wine-stained handkerchief and placed it neatly on the table. I believe we're done here, he said. Celeste crossed her arms, satisfied. Enjoy your borrowed seat while you can. Malcolm picked up his jacket, the dark red stain still visible, and draped it over his arm. I won't, he replied. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a conclusion. Behind Celeste, Brigadier General Donovan pushed her chair back, her face tight. She didn't look at Celeste. She didn't apologize. She didn't intervene. She simply said to no one in particular, this just became a very long night. A journalist near the back of the room typed a single sentence and paused before hitting save. Security finally moved, but Malcolm raised a hand slightly. That won't be necessary. He looked once more at Celeste Hawthorne, not with anger, not with triumph, with clarity. What Celeste didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to ask, was who Malcolm Reed actually was. She didn't know that he was the CEO of Apex Meridian Systems, the company that owned the core technology Hawthorne Dynamics needed to qualify for the billion-dollar contract her family was desperate to win. She didn't know that his presence at the gala wasn't social. It was evaluative, and she didn't know that within minutes of that wine hitting his face, Malcolm Reed would make a decision, quietly, professionally, that would remove her family from the future they believed was guaranteed. Sometimes, power doesn't shout. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it lets you reveal exactly who you are before it walks away. The tension didn't disappear after the wine hit Malcolm Reed's suit. It lingered. It crawled through the grand ballroom of the plaza like a low electrical hum, threading itself between tables, into whispered conversations, into the uneasy silence that followed Celeste Hawthorne's retreat to her seat. People pretended to return to their meals, but no one tasted anything. The room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Malcolm remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. He wasn't waiting for an apology. He wasn't waiting for security. He was listening to the room, to the silence, to what people revealed when they thought the moment had passed. A polite smile he had learned long ago could be sharper than anger. He sat down, slowly, folding his jacket over the back of the chair. The wine stain was visible, unavoidable. A mark. He left it that way on purpose. Across from him, Brigadier General Claire Donovan didn't touch her drink. Her jaw was set, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the chandeliers. I want to be clear, she said quietly, leaning toward Malcolm without looking at him. That was unacceptable. Malcolm nodded once. I know. At the neighboring table, a tech executive shifted uncomfortably. Is this being handled? He asked no one in particular. Donovan's response was clipped. It is. Celeste Hawthorne, meanwhile, basked in the familiar warmth of control. Marjorie Slade leaned toward her, eyes bright. Well, Marjorie murmured, that was dramatic. Celeste took a measured sip of water. Necessary, she replied. These things get out of hand if you let them. She scanned the room, expecting reassurance. A few people avoided her eyes. Others nodded faintly, the way they always did when she enforced boundaries they benefited from, but never wanted to claim. Graham Hawthorne didn't look at her. He stood near the edge of the ballroom phone, pressed to his ear, his face pale. No, he said quietly. I'm here. Yes, now. He hung up and stared at the crowd, suddenly aware of how many conversations had stopped when Celeste stood earlier. How many eyes had followed the glass. How many phones were still out. He walked toward her table. Celeste, he said under his breath, leaning in close. We need to talk. She didn't look at him. Later. No, Graham said. Now. She turned annoyed. You're overreacting. Graham swallowed. Do you have any idea who that man is? Celeste scoffed. I know exactly what he is. That's not what I asked. She studied him for a moment, then looked past him toward Malcolm's table. The man was speaking quietly now with Donovan, and another official Celeste recognized but couldn't place. Their heads were close, focused. Someone who won't be here much longer, Celeste said coolly. Graham didn't answer. He couldn't. The message on his phone replayed in his mind. We need to talk. Immediately. Across the room, Elena Morales moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her expression neutral, her phone low at her side. She wasn't recording anymore. She didn't need to. The story had already written itself. She paused near Nina Park, who stood rigid by the stagehands clasped too tightly. You okay? Elena asked softly. Nina exhaled. I've run events for 20 years. I've never seen anything like that. Elena nodded. You just did. At Malcolm's table, the conversation had shifted not away from the incident, but through it. Did you expect this? Donovan asked. Malcolm considered the question. I expected clarity. One of the executives frowned. From a gala. From people. Malcolm replied. Put enough pressure on a room like this, and it shows you who thinks power belongs to them by default. Donovan's lips pressed into a thin line. And tonight, Malcolm glanced briefly toward Celeste, who was laughing now at something Marjorie had said. The sound rang false. Tonight was efficient, he said. That word again. Efficient. At a nearby table, a donor whispered, I thought this was about charity. Someone else replied, It always is. Just not the kind you think. Security hovered closer now, uncertain what they were supposed to do with a moment that had already happened. No one was yelling. No one was being escorted out. And yet something irreversible had taken place. Malcolm rose again, this time to excuse himself. As he stood, several people stood with him, not in solidarity, not in protest, but instinctively. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Celeste noticed. Her smile faltered for the first time that evening. Malcolm walked toward the exit, unhurried. Conversations followed him like ripples. He felt it, the shift from spectacle to consequence. Near the doors, he paused as Elena Morales stepped into his path. Mr. Reed, she said, professional but direct. Do you have a comment? Malcolm looked at her, assessing, then nodded once. Not tonight. She held his gaze. Is this going to matter tomorrow? Malcolm gave a small, polite smile. It already does. He stepped past her and disappeared into the hallway. Inside the ballroom, the music resumed tentative and off-tempo. Applause scattered weakly, then died. Celeste watched the doors close behind him, irritation curdling into something colder. He thinks he's clever, she muttered. Marjorie leaned in. Don't let it get to you. It doesn't, Celeste said quickly. Men like that always overplay their hand. But as she spoke, she noticed Brigadier General Donovan had left the table as well. And the executive, who had been laughing with Celeste earlier, was now checking his phone, his brow furrowed. Graham returned his face tight. We're leaving early, he said. Celeste stared at him. Excuse me, this isn't over, Graham said. And I don't think it went the way you think it did. Celeste straightened. I handled a problem. Graham met her eyes. You created one. For the first time that night, Celeste felt it the faintest crack in her certainty. Not fear, not regret, uncertainty. Around them, the room kept moving, kept pretending. But beneath the polished surface, decisions were already being revised. Calls were being drafted. Names were being reconsidered. And somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, Malcolm Reed was already thinking 3 steps ahead. His expression, calm, his conclusions settled. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't confrontation. It's letting someone show you exactly who they are, then deciding what they're no longer allowed to touch. The call came before sunrise. At 6:12 a.m., Graham Hawthorne was standing in his home office, tie-loosened, coffee untouched, watching pre-market numbers flicker on his screen. Hawthorne Dynamics had opened down 2%, nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to make his chest tighten. The gala was supposed to stabilize confidence. Instead, every headline preview scrolling across his phone hinted at something else entirely. Then his phone rang. It wasn't a number he recognized, no name, just a secure line indicator that made his stomach drop. Graham Hawthorne, he answered. Mr. Hawthorne, a calm voice said, This is Brigadier General Claire Donovan. We need to speak immediately. Graham swallowed. Of course. Is this about last night? There was a pause, brief, deliberate. Yes, Donovan said. And about this morning. Before Graham could respond, the line went dead. He stood there for a moment, phone still pressed to his ear, the quiet of the house suddenly oppressive. Upstairs, Celeste was still asleep, wrapped in certainty. Graham wished for just a second that he could go back 12 hours and pull her arm away from that table. By 6:30, his inbox exploded. Subject lines stacked on top of one another, like warnings he couldn't unread. Re-partnership review. Urgent contract. Eligibility. Following up on last night. The market didn't need a press release. It sensed instability the way sharks sensed blood. Across the city, in a modest hotel room overlooking the Hudson, Malcolm Reed sat at a small desk with a legal pad and a single cup of black coffee. His suit jacket hung neatly over a chair, the wine-stained handkerchief folded and set aside. He hadn't slept much. He didn't need to. At 6:45, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and answered without hesitation. Good morning. Morning, said a familiar voice from the other end. We're aligned. Malcolm nodded once, even though no one could see him. Then proceed. That was it. No anger, no raised voices, just confirmation. By 7:00 a.m., the first move was already in motion. Hawthorne Dynamics General Counsel burst into Graham's office without knocking. We've got a problem. Graham looked up sharply. Define problem. They're pulling the licensing discussion, the lawyer said. Apex Meridian Systems just withdrew from the preliminary partnership framework. Graham's heart slammed against his ribs. That's not possible. We haven't even finalized terms. That's exactly the point, the lawyer replied. They don't need to. Apex Meridian Systems wasn't a vendor. It wasn't a subcontractor. It was the keystone. Their autonomous guidance architecture was the final technical requirement needed to qualify for the Autonomous Systems Initiative, the billion-dollar defense program Hawthorne Dynamics had been chasing for over a year. Without that technology, Hawthorne didn't just lose leverage. They lost eligibility. Graham's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an internal alert. Autonomous Systems Initiative Shortlist, updated. He opened the file with shaking hands. Hawthorne Dynamics was no longer on it. Across the city, Celeste Hawthorne scrolled through her phone from the comfort of her bed, a faint smile playing on her lips. The internet was loud, as expected. Some outrage, some applause. Plenty of people praising her for saying what others wouldn't. She liked that. Her phone rang. Graham's name flashed on the screen. What she answered. "Get dressed." He set his voice tight. "We need to talk." She frowned. "You're being dramatic." "No," Graham replied. "I'm being late." By 7:30, financial news outlets had picked up the movement. Hawthorne Dynamics shares slide amid gala controversy. Defense analysts, flag contract, risk after Apex Meridian withdrawal. Elena Morales read the headlines from a coffee shop near her office, her pen tapping against the table. She didn't smile. This wasn't schadenfreude. It was confirmation. She dialed a source. "Is it official?" she asked. The voice on the other end sighed. "It's done. Because of the gala. Because of the decision that followed it." At 8:15, Graham and Celeste sat across from each other at the kitchen island. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Graham's phone vibrating every few seconds. Celeste crossed her arms. "You're letting this get out of control." Graham stared at her. "Do you know who Malcolm Reed is?" She rolled her eyes. "You already asked me that. He's the CEO of Apex Meridian Systems," Graham said. "They own the guidance platform we need to qualify for the contract." Celeste laughed once. "So, that doesn't give him power over us." Graham pushed his phone across the counter and turned the screen toward her. The shortlist stared back at her. Her name wasn't on it. Their company wasn't on it. "The deal is gone," Graham said. "As of this morning." The smile slid off Celeste's face. "That's impossible," she said. "You don't lose a billion-dollar contract over a misunderstanding." "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Graham snapped. "This was a character assessment." Her voice rose. "You're telling me he did this because I embarrassed him." Graham shook his head slowly. "No. He did it because you showed him exactly who we are." At 9:00 a.m., the board convened an emergency call. Faces filled the screen, some angry, some frightened, all calculating. The withdrawal came directly from Apex Meridian, the COO said. No negotiation. No delay. One board member leaned forward. "Can we counter no?" The legal counsel replied, "They didn't breach anything. They exercised discretion." Silence settled over the call. At 9:42, Malcolm Reed sent a single email. Subject Partnership Review. Thank you for the discussion. After further evaluation, Apex Meridian Systems will not be proceeding with any partnership related to the Autonomous Systems Initiative. This decision is final. Malcolm Reed, CEO, Apex Meridian Systems. That was it. No justification, no accusation, no explanation. The $1 billion didn't disappear with a crash. It evaporated. By 10:30, the market had adjusted. By noon, the narrative had hardened. And by the time Graham Hawthorne received the final confirmation for a 2:00 p.m. meeting at the Pentagon, he understood something with absolute clarity. The wine hadn't cost them the deal. The certainty behind it had. Because sometimes the most expensive mistake isn't the action itself. It's revealing publicly, irrevocably, that you don't understand what power is actually watching for. The room had no windows. That was the first thing Graham Hawthorne noticed as the heavy door closed behind him inside the Pentagon. No sunlight, no city noise, just a long table-muted lights and the quiet hum of a building designed for decisions that never made headlines. This was not a negotiation room. This was an accounting room. Malcolm Reed sat at the far end of the table, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. The wine-stained suit was gone. In its place was a simple charcoal jacket, crisp, unremarkable, almost deliberately plain. There was no trace of the man who had been humiliated the night before, only the man who had measured it. Brigadier General Claire Donovan took the seat to Malcolm's right. Two procurement officials sat across from Graham. A legal counsel Graham recognized from previous briefings nodded politely, but without warmth. Mr. Hawthorne Donovan said, her voice calm and formal. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Graham forced a nod and took his seat. His hands trembled briefly before he folded them together. "I want to begin by setting expectations," Donovan continued. "This meeting is not about restoring the Autonomous Systems Initiative contract. That decision has already been finalized." Graham swallowed. Understood. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. "This meeting is about whether your company has a future in this space at all." The words landed without malice. That made them heavier. Graham drew a breath. "Before anything else, I want to say that what happened at the gala was unacceptable. My wife's behavior." Malcolm raised a hand, not to interrupt, but to pause. "This isn't about your wife," he said evenly. "It's about your company." Donovan nodded. "And about patterns." One of the procurement officials slid a folder across the table. Graham didn't open it yet. He already sensed what was inside. "Let me explain something," Malcolm said. "The technology Apex Meridian develops isn't consumer software. It doesn't just optimize profit margins. It governs autonomous decision-making in environments where mistakes cost lives." Graham nodded quickly. "We understand that responsibility." "Do you?" Malcolm asked, his tone curious rather than confrontational. "Because responsibility doesn't begin with code. It begins with culture." Graham hesitated. Malcolm continued. "Last night wasn't an anomaly. It was a demonstration. Your company's public representative by marriage by visibility expressed a belief that power belongs to certain people by default." Graham opened the folder. Inside were summaries, not gossip, documentation, workplace complaints, settled quietly, language flagged by HR and reclassified as miscommunication, exit interviews that mentioned bias but were never escalated. A timeline Graham recognized but had never seen assembled this way. "These are not disqualifying on their own," Donovan said. "Many companies struggle with culture. What matters is how they respond." Graham looked up. "We've made changes." Malcolm nodded. "On paper." The room was silent again. When Apex Meridian partners with a defense contractor, Malcolm said, "We don't just integrate systems. We align values. Because the people building these systems determine how they're deployed." One of the officials leaned forward. "We don't need perfection. We need accountability." Graham's voice cracked slightly. Tell me what that looks like. Malcolm studied him for a moment, not as an adversary, as a variable. It looks like separation, Malcolm said, between power and entitlement. Graham frowned. I'm not sure I understand, Donovan answered. It means your company cannot be publicly represented by someone who undermines its legitimacy. Graham's chest tightened. He knew where this was going. It means Malcolm added that reform has to be structural, not performative. He slid a single-page document across the table. At the top, in clean, unadorned type, were 5 bullet points: independent workplace culture audit, third-party reporting and whistleblower protections, executive compensation tied to culture benchmarks, supplier and hiring equity review, public transparency on corrective actions. This, Malcolm said, is the baseline. Graham stared at the page. And if we agree, Malcolm didn't hesitate, you'll be considered for future initiatives, not this one. That opportunity is gone. Graham closed his eyes briefly. $1 billion erased with the calm of a man turning a page. And my wife? He asked quietly. Malcolm's expression didn't change. That decision isn't mine. Donovan's voice softened slightly. But the optics are not optional, Mr. Hawthorne. Graham nodded. He understood now. This wasn't punishment. It was containment. The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshake, no press statement, just a door opening and the quiet certainty that something irreversible had occurred. Outside, Graham sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Board members, legal counsel, Celeste. He didn't answer. When he finally drove home, the house felt unfamiliar. Celeste was in the living room, laptop open, recording equipment set up behind her. She was rehearsing lines, confident, defiant. Perfect timing, she said when she saw him. I'm setting the record straight. Graham unplugged the lights. What are you doing? She snapped. We're done, he said. She laughed. With what with pretending this can be spun? Her smile faltered. What happened at the Pentagon? Graham looked at her. Really looked. For the first time without the buffer of loyalty. They didn't ask about the wine, he said. They asked about who we are. Celeste crossed her arms. So we fight back. Graham shook his head. No. We change, or we disappear. She scoffed. You're choosing them over me. I'm choosing the truth, Graham said quietly, and the people who will still be here after this. Later that night, the Hawthorne Dynamics Board convened. Faces hardened by decades of defense contracts now showed something else: fear. The vote was unanimous. Celeste Hawthorne would no longer represent the company in any capacity. Her name would be removed from all affiliated foundations. Her access would be limited. Public statements would be issued. Audits would begin, not because of a glass of wine, because of what it revealed. As the meeting ended, Graham remained seated, staring at the empty chairs. Power, he realized, wasn't loud. It didn't humiliate. It watched, documented, and decided. And once it did, there was no arguing with the room that had no windows. The scandal didn't end when the headlines faded. It changed shape. In the weeks after the gala, Celeste Hawthorne learned what silence felt like. Invitations stopped arriving. Boards she once sat on quietly removed her name from their websites. People who had laughed at her jokes now crossed the street to avoid her. Not out of anger, out of distance. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument worth remembering, just absence. Celeste spent the first days pacing the house, scrolling through articles that no longer needed her photo to tell the story. The narrative had moved on from outrage to analysis, from spectacle to consequence. She told herself it would pass, that America had a short attention span. She was wrong. At Hawthorne Dynamics, the change was immediate and visible. Graham moved his office out of the executive wing and into a glass-walled space on the main floor. He canceled 2 public appearances and replaced them with closed-door meetings. Consultants arrived without ceremony. So did auditors. The board didn't ask him to explain his marriage. They asked him to explain his plan. For the first time in years, Hawthorne Dynamics wasn't being judged by its legacy. It was being evaluated by its behavior. Graham didn't argue. He signed the audit order himself. Independent teams reviewed hiring practices, promotion pipelines, exit interviews that had once been ignored. The findings weren't sensational. They were worse than that. They were consistent. Patterns emerged. Quiet barriers. Informal networks. Decisions justified as fit or culture that always seemed to land the same way. Nothing illegal enough to make headlines on its own. Enough to explain everything. When the results were published internally, Graham addressed the company without a script. "We told ourselves we were neutral," he said. "We weren't. And neutrality didn't protect us. It exposed us." Some employees were angry, others relieved, many were tired. Change, it turned out, wasn't inspirational. It was uncomfortable. Across town, Malcolm Reed stood before a room of procurement leaders and agency advisors. He didn't mention Celeste Hawthorne. He didn't need to. What happened wasn't personal, he said. It was procedural. He outlined what would come to be known as the Reed Standard, not as a punishment, but as a filter, a way to determine which companies could be trusted with systems that made life and death decisions, culture audits, independent reporting channels, leadership accountability tied to measurable behavior, public transparency that didn't wait for lawsuits to force it. Technical excellence means nothing if it's wrapped in contempt, Malcolm said. We don't partner with companies who confuse entitlement with leadership. Some resisted. Others adapted quickly. Within months, several agencies quietly adopted the same criteria. Not because of the scandal, because the logic was unassailable. Back in New York, Elena Morales published a long-form piece that avoided Celeste's name entirely. The headline read, "When Power Stops Apologizing to Itself." The article wasn't about wine or words. It was about rooms. Who controlled them? Who assumed ownership without question? And what happened when that assumption met a standard instead of a person willing to absorb it? Celeste read the article twice. Then she stopped reading altogether. She took a position she had never imagined she would accept, unpaid anonymous part of a restorative justice program in Harlem. It wasn't ordered. It wasn't negotiated. It was suggested by an attorney who understood the difference between optics and repair. Her first day, no one recognized her. She served meals, filed paperwork, listened more than she spoke. The work was quiet, necessary, unforgiving in its ordinariness. One afternoon, a man in his late 50s sat across from her, filling out a job application. He had lost his position after reporting discriminatory behavior at a previous employer. The complaint went nowhere. He went hungry. "You used to be important. he said casually, without accusation. Didn't you? Celeste paused. I used to think I was. He nodded. Most people do. There was no absolution in that moment, no dramatic shift, just discomfort that didn't leave when the day ended. Graham filed for divorce 3 months later, not out of anger, out of clarity. I can't rebuild something if I'm pretending nothing broke, he told her. She didn't argue. At Hawthorne Dynamics, the transformation continued. Leadership changed. Metrics changed. The company lost contracts. Then slowly, it earned some back. Not because it was forgiven, because it was verifiable. The press noticed. Then the industry. By the end of the year, Hawthorne Dynamics was no longer cited as a cautionary tale. It was referenced as a case study, not in redemption. In correction, Malcolm Reed declined interviews about the gala. He didn't comment on Celeste Hawthorne's trajectory. When asked why, he answered simply, "This was never about one woman," he said. It was about what happens when systems stop excusing behavior they've normalized. He returned to work, to meetings that mattered, to decisions that wouldn't trend, but would endure. On a cold evening in December, Celeste finished her shift and stepped outside into the early darkness. The city moved around her indifferent alive. She pulled her coat tighter and walked to the subway alone, but no longer insulated. She thought about that night at the plaza, the room, the certainty, the way she had believed power would protect her from consequence. She understood now that power had done the opposite. It had recorded her. The scandal didn't end her life. It ended a version of it. What followed wasn't punishment. It was work. And work she was learning didn't care who you used to be. It only responded to who you chose to become next. What happened at the Plaza Hotel was never just about a glass of wine. It was about how power reveals itself when it thinks no one important is watching. Celeste Hawthorne believed she understood the rules of the world she lived in. She believed power was inherited, guarded, and enforced by people who knew how to sit at the right tables and speak with the right confidence. In that ballroom, surrounded by chandeliers and status, she acted on an assumption she had carried for years, that dignity could be granted or taken away based on who she thought deserved it. Malcolm Reed didn't confront her. He didn't shout. He didn't demand an apology. He did something far more consequential. He paid attention. By staying calm, by refusing to perform outrage, Malcolm allowed Celeste to fully expose her values, not in private, not through rumor, but in front of the very systems that decide who is trusted with influence money and responsibility. The wine wasn't the turning point. The certainty behind it was. Graham Hawthorne learned a harder lesson. He discovered that legacy doesn't protect you when your culture contradicts your mission. He watched a billion-dollar opportunity disappear, not because of a technical failure, but because character had finally been weighed alongside capability. And for the first time, he chose reform over denial, transparency over spin, and long-term credibility over short-term comfort. Celeste's reckoning was quieter. There was no cinematic punishment, no public redemption arc designed for applause. There was only the slow removal of access, the loss of insulation, and the uncomfortable work of seeing people as human beings rather than obstacles or accessories. Her story didn't end in forgiveness. It ended in accountability and the understanding that accountability is not an ending, but a beginning. Malcolm Reed's role in this story matters most because of what he didn't do. He didn't use his authority to humiliate. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't turn pain into spectacle. Instead, he transformed a moment of public cruelty into a standard one that asked a simple question of powerful institutions. Can we trust you with responsibility if you cannot demonstrate respect? That question extends far beyond defense contracts and boardrooms. The lesson in this story is not that racism is wrong. Most people already know that. The deeper lesson is that behavior reveals values, and values determine access. In today's world, power is no longer impressed by loud confidence or inherited status alone. It is watching how people treat others when they believe the rules don't apply to them. So how do we apply this to our own lives? First, understand that dignity is not situational. How you treat the waiter, the coworker with less authority, the stranger who can't offer you anything in return, those moments define your character more accurately than any resume or title. Second, recognize that silence is a form of participation. The room at the plaza didn't change because one person acted cruelly. It changed because others were forced to decide whether they would continue excusing behavior they had quietly tolerated for years. And finally, remember that accountability isn't about punishment. It's about correction. Growth doesn't come from being spared consequences. It comes from facing them honestly and choosing to do better afterward. This story reminds us that true power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to dominate. It listens, evaluates, and decides with clarity. If this story made you think differently about leadership responsibility or the quiet moments where character is revealed, then you already understand why stories like this matter. If you believe conversations about accountability, justice, and real transformation deserve more space, support this channel by subscribing. Your support gives us the motivation to keep telling stories that don't look away, don't water things down, and don't pretend these moments don't shape our world. Subscribe, stay with us, and be part of the audience that believes stories can challenge power and make it better.